Imagine waking up one morning and realizing the government has strong opinions about your soup. Not your politics, not your religion, your soup. Specifically how salty it is. Because in pre-revolutionary France, there was a time when adding the wrong amount of salt to your dinner wasn't just bad cooking, it was suspicious behavior. And that's not a metaphor. This is the story about the French salt tax. A policy so aggressively stupid, it turned peasants into smugglers, children into criminals, and dinner tables into crime scenes. It wasn't about luxury. It wasn't about excess. It was about survival. Salt preserved food. Salt kept people alive. Salt was non-negotiable. So naturally, the French government decided to make it expensive, mandatory, and illegal to buy freely. On this episode of Bear Markets and Bad Decisions, we're talking about the tax that made everyone a lawbreaker, why enforcing it required home inspections for seasoning, and how a policy meant to fund the state quietly taught an entire country to hate the system. Because when the law criminalizes dinner, revolutions don't start with speeches. They start with stew. Act 1. Salt wasn't a flavor, it was a lifeline. Before salt was a tax, it was survival. This is the part modern brains struggle with, because today, salt is something you're vaguely told to avoid. It's in everything. You don't think about salt. You accidentally consume too much of it while eating chips out of a bag that you weren't even hungry for. But in pre-revolutionary France, salt was the difference between eating in February and not eating in February. There were no refrigerators, no freezers, no vacuum seals. If you wanted food to last longer than a few days, you salted it. Meat, fish, vegetables. Salt didn't make things fancy, it made them possible. If you were a peasant family, salt meant your pig didn't rot before winter, your fish didn't poison you, your grain lasted long enough to matter. Salt wasn't seasoning, salt was insurance. Everyone needed it, every day, forever, which made it incredibly boring and incredibly powerful. Because the most dangerous thing a government can notice is the product that 1, everyone needs, 2, can't be substituted, and 3, doesn't care about your income. That's not a luxury good, that's leverage. Now zoom in on a typical household. You're not wealthy, you're not starving, yet. You live in a countryside, you grow some food, you barter, you scrape by. Your margins are thin, but they exist. Salt is already a cost, but it's predictable. You buy what you need, you preserve what you can, you stretch meals when times are tight. This is a fragile balance, but it is a balance. And then the rules change. Not all at once, not dramatically, quietly, bureaucratically, like all dangerous things. Suddenly, salt isn't just something you buy, it's something you're assigned. The state decides how much salt you must purchase each year, regardless of whether you need it, can afford it, or have anywhere to put it. Imagine being told you are required to buy this much toilet paper annually. No, we don't care if you live alone. Yes, we will check. That's the shift. Salt moves from household decision to state-managed necessity. And once that happens, everything changes. Because now salt isn't priced by usefulness, it's priced by decree, and not evenly. Different regions pay different prices. Some provinces pay several times more than others for the exact same mineral, which means 2 villages, 10 miles apart, can live in completely different economic realities. One family salt their meat comfortably, the other waters down soup and pretends it's fine. Same country, same king, same salt. And here's where resentment starts to ferment. Not because people are ignorant, but because they're doing math. They know how much salt used to cost. They know how much food they have. They know how long winter lasts. And they know when something doesn't add up. This wasn't abstract injustice. It was tactile. It lived in kitchens, in barrels, in empty cupboards. Every coin spent on salt was a coin not spent on bread. Every forced purchase pushed households closer to the line they couldn't cross. And when a system turns a necessity into a burden, people don't rebel immediately. They adapt. They stretch. They cut corners. They whisper. Because at first, everyone assumes this is temporary. A bad year. A weird rule. Something that will be corrected. It almost never is. By the time people realize this isn't a phase, that this is the new normal, the damage is already baked in. Salt has stopped being invisible. It's now the most emotionally charged substance in the room. And once that happens, the system has a problem. Because the moment survival goods become symbols of unfairness, enforcement stops being technical and starts being personal. And that's when ordinary people, not radicals, not rebels, begin doing something very dangerous. They start ignoring the rules, not out of defiance, out of necessity. Act 2. When everyone quietly became a criminal. So, once salt stopped being affordable and started being mandatory, people didn't revolt. They recalculated. And this is important because history loves to pretend that resistance always looks dramatic. It doesn't. Most of the time it looks like a quiet decision made over a pot of soup. People didn't say down with the king. They said, I'm not paying that. And suddenly France had a problem. Because when a law collides with daily life, enforcement becomes a full-time job. And the French state absolutely tried. Salt was only allowed to be sold at official government warehouses called greniers à sel. You couldn't buy salt from a neighbor. You couldn't trade for it. You couldn't grab a little extra on the side. You had to show up, buy your assigned amount, pay the assigned price, and smile like this made sense. It did not. Prices were wildly uneven. In some regions, salt was merely annoying. In others, it was brutally expensive. Same mineral, same kingdom, completely different reality. So people noticed something very obvious. Salt didn't magically change when it crossed a provincial border, which meant if you lived near one, the math got very tempting. And that's how smuggling started. Not the cinematic kind, not dramatic cloaks, not secret handshakes. This was errand-level crime. Someone walks to the next village. Someone brings a sack back. Someone doesn't ask questions. Salt was light, portable, easy to hide. And suddenly, everyone knew someone who knew someone. And here's the thing the government never understood. No one thought of this as a crime. They thought of this as correcting a bad price. If the official price was nonsense, then the unofficial price felt fair. And when the law punishes fairness, people stop respecting the law, which made enforcement a nightmare. The Crown created a special force just to deal with salt crimes. They weren't tax collectors with ledgers. They were inspectors with authority to search homes. Yes, homes. They could show up unannounced, demand to see your salt supply, and ask questions like, why do you have more than you were assigned? Why do you have less? Why does the stew taste ambitious? They checked cupboards, barrels, kitchens. Imagine the government auditing your spice rack. Now imagine being poor. People hid salt in walls, in mattresses, in bread dough. They diluted it. They lied about it. Neighbors covered for neighbors because everyone understood the stakes. And here's where it gets darker and more absurd. Children became smugglers. Because kids were less likely to be searched, less likely to be arrested, less likely to be punished severely. So a 10-year-old carrying a pouch of salt across a border wasn't a criminal mastermind. They were helping their family eat. And the penalties? Brutal. People were fined sums they couldn't pay, sent to prison, sent to forced labor, chained to ships for moving salt. Salt! At some point, the punishment stopped reinforcing the law and started exposing its insanity. Because when a system demands obedience but delivers suffering, compliance doesn't increase, cynicism does. People stopped believing the rules were legitimate. They stopped believing enforcement was fair. They stopped believing the state understood their lives at all. And once that happens, the damage spreads. Because now the government isn't just taxing salt, it's teaching people something far more dangerous. That survival requires disobedience. That lying is practical. That rules are optional if they're stupid enough. This wasn't rebellion yet, but it was rehearsal. France was becoming a country where millions of people were technically criminals, not because they were immoral, but because the law had drifted too far from reality. And the more aggressively the state pushed, the more casually people pushed back. Quietly, daily, together, which is always the most unstable phase of any system. Because when everyone breaks the law just a little, the law doesn't collapse loudly, it rots. Act 3. When the math turned political. For a long time, the French government convinced itself this was manageable. Sure, some people were smuggling salt. Sure, inspectors were getting lied to. Sure, half the countryside was technically breaking the law. But from Versailles, it still looked like non-compliance, not crisis. And that's the classic mistake. Because what was actually happening wasn't random law breaking. It was coordination. People weren't just ignoring rules individually. They were doing it together. Villages shared routes. Families shared hiding spots. Entire regions quietly agreed that the official system didn't apply anymore. This is the moment where a bad tax becomes a political problem. Because once everyone understands the workaround, the law stops functioning as a law and starts functioning as a suggestion, enforced only when someone gets unlucky. And that's corrosive. Salt smuggling became so common that local officials often looked the other way. Some were bribed. Some just didn't want to arrest their neighbors. Some understood perfectly well that enforcing the law would cause more chaos than ignoring it, which put the state in an impossible position. If they enforced the Gabelle aggressively, they fueled anger and unrest. If they didn't enforce it, they lost authority. So they did the worst possible thing. They enforced it selectively. And selective enforcement is how resentment turns into rage. Because now it wasn't just about salt, it was about who got punished. Wealthy households found ways around the rules. They paid fines. They bribed officials. They had storage, legal help, distance from scrutiny. Poor families didn't. So the same crime, buying cheaper salt, produced very different outcomes depending on who you were. One person paid a fee and moved on. Another lost a year of income. Another went to prison. And once people noticed the pattern, the illusion cracked completely. This wasn't a shared sacrifice. This wasn't national policy. This was pain flowing downhill. At that point, salt inspections stopped feeling like taxation and started feeling like harassment. These weren't bureaucrats, they were intruders. Symbols of the state that understood ledgers better than lives. Confrontations escalated. Inspectors were threatened, chased off, attacked. In some areas, they simply stopped showing up because it wasn't safe. Salt warehouses were raided, ledgers destroyed, entire shipments disappeared. And here's the important part. This wasn't ideological. People weren't talking about liberty or rights yet. They weren't quoting philosophers. They weren't drafting manifestos. They were saying something much simpler. This doesn't work. The Gabelle had crossed a line. It had stopped being a revenue tool and become a daily insult. Because when a government insists on a system everyone knows is broken and punishes people for adapting, the anger isn't sudden, it's cumulative. It builds every time someone waters down soup, every time a child carries contraband instead of bread, every time a neighbor gets fined for surviving correctly. And by the time officials finally realize they have a legitimacy problem, it's usually too late. France didn't explode because of salt alone. But salt taught people something dangerous long before the revolution ever began. That the system could be ignored, that rules weren't sacred, that authority could be outsmarted or overwhelmed. Once people learn that lesson at scale, they don't forget it, and the state never fully recovered its credibility in the countryside after that. Salt didn't start a revolution, but it trained a population how to live without believing the system deserved obedience. And that's the kind of damage no tax revenue can fix. Act 4. How a salt tax taught France to stop believing. By the time the French Revolution finally arrived, the Gabelle had been around for centuries, which means something important. People weren't shocked by it anymore. They were trained by it. Generations of French peasants had grown up learning the same lesson over and over again. The law does not reflect reality. Compliance is punished more than cleverness. Survival requires bending the rules, and the people making the rules will never feel the consequences. That's not a small thing to teach an entire population, because when revolution finally comes, it's rarely sparked by a new injustice. It's triggered by an old one that people have already decided is illegitimate. The Gabelle didn't radicalize France overnight. It quietly hollowed out trust. When the monarchy needed cooperation, real cooperation, it didn't have it. Need more taxes to fund wars? People hid income. Need food distributions during shortages? People distrusted state control. Need patience during crisis? People laughed bitterly. Why would they believe a system that had spent decades policing their kitchens? By the late 1700s, salt had become shorthand for everything people hated about the regime. Arbitrary rules, unequal burden, selective enforcement, and a total disconnect between policy and lived experience. When the Estates General met in 1789, complaints about the salt tax were everywhere. In pamphlets, petitions, grievance lists, not because salt was the worst problem, but because it was the most familiar one. Everyone understood it. Everyone had a story. Everyone had been touched by it in some small, humiliating way. And that matters, because revolutions don't run on theory. They run on shared memories. The French Revolution is often told as a story of ideas, liberty, equality, fraternity. But underneath that poetry was something much more practical. People no longer believed the state knew what it was doing. Or worse, they believed it knew and didn't care. The Gabelle symbolized a government that couldn't adapt, couldn't admit mistakes, and couldn't imagine life at the bottom. Even when officials knew the tax was inefficient, even when they knew it encouraged crime, even when they knew enforcement cost more than it raised. They kept it because changing it would mean admitting the system was wrong. And once the government becomes more committed to preserving its authority than preserving legitimacy, collapse becomes a matter of timing. By the time the salt tax was finally abolished during the Revolution, it wasn't celebrated as reform. It was treated like an overdue apology. And apologies don't rebuild trust. They just confirm it was broken. The Gabelle didn't cause the French Revolution, but it taught millions of people something crucial before the storm ever arrived. That the rules were not moral, that obedience was optional, that survival came first. And once a population internalizes that lesson, they don't suddenly forget it when times get hard. They remember exactly who taught it to them. Act 5. When systems stop listening. Here's the uncomfortable truth the salt tax teaches us. Systems don't usually fail because they're evil. They fail because they stop listening. The Gabelle didn't begin as cruelty. It began as bookkeeping. A way to fund wars, stabilize revenue, and keep the state running. But over time, the math outlived the people. What mattered wasn't whether the tax worked. It mattered that it existed. That it had always existed. That changing it would admit error. And once that mindset takes hold, systems stop asking the most important question. Is this still making life possible for the people living under it? Instead, they ask safer ones. Is this legal? Is this consistent? Is this defensible on paper? Those are not the same thing. Because people don't live on paper. They live in kitchens, in grocery lines, in rent checks, in quiet trade-offs no spreadsheet ever sees. When salt becomes unaffordable, the French didn't riot immediately. They adapted. They smuggled. They rationed. They bent the rules just enough to survive. And for a long time, the system mistook adaptation for stability. That's the most dangerous misread a system can make. Because adaptation isn't acceptance. It's pressure, quietly redistributing itself. You see it today when people take on debt instead of spending, work multiple jobs instead of demanding raises, delay families instead of affording housing, stop trusting institutions without ever announcing it. From the outside, everything looks calm. No riots, no torches, no barricades. But under the surface, the same thing is happening that happened in rural France. People are solving problems around the system instead of with it. And once that becomes the norm, legitimacy erodes. Not loudly, but permanently. The French state didn't collapse because people were angry. It collapsed because people had already learned how to live without believing it. By the time leaders realized trust was gone, there was nothing left to negotiate with. That's the warning hidden inside this very silly, very human story about salt. Not that taxes are bad, not that governments are doomed, but that systems cannot survive long after the people inside them stop believing they're meant to help. Because when a system becomes something people endure instead of rely on, it doesn't need enemies. It just needs time. And history is very patient. So if you learned anything today, it's this. Never underestimate a government that decides to tax soup seasoning. Because nothing says stable system quite like turning dinner into a felony. If you enjoyed this episode, or if it made you look suspiciously at your salt shaker, do me a favor. Follow or subscribe to the show, leave a review, or send this to someone who thinks history is boring but hates Big Brother. It genuinely helps more than you know. This has been Bear Markets and Bad Decisions. I'm Heather Shell, and until next week, remember, revolutions don't start with speeches, they start when the price of staples stop making sense. And if anyone tries to tax your salt, I can send a kid over to your house. Just don't ask how I got him.